July 5, 1943. Sicily. A Canadian corporal pulls the trigger. The bomb punches through the side of a Panzer IV, and the turret erupts. Flames crawl out of every hatch. The crew never opens the door. 32 pounds of ugly British steel just cremated a German tank, and not a single man on that street knows where the shot came from. No smoke trail, no flash, no roar, just a dull thud and a dead tank. That weapon was not a rocket launcher. It had no rocket. It had no barrel. It fired bombs off a steel rod using a spring that took 200 pounds of force to cock. Soldiers hated carrying it. Soldiers cursed loading it. Soldiers could barely lift it. And between 1943 and 1945, that crude, ugly, brutal device destroyed 7% of all German tanks knocked out by British forces during the Normandy invasion. That kill rate beat the RAF Typhoons firing rockets from the sky. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded to men who used it. 161 Canadian combat officers surveyed after the war ranked it the #1 most effective infantry weapon they had ever seen, placing it above the Bren gun. The man who invented the concept behind it spent 10 years being laughed out of every military office in London. His name was Stuart Blacker. He was a retired Indian Army colonel with no formal engineering degree, no laboratory, and no credibility. And the weapon the entire British Ordnance Board declared would fail under any conceivable conditions became the deadliest anti-tank tool in the infantry's hands. This is the story of how a spring defeated a rocket, and why Britain looked at America's bazooka and said no. 1940, the year everything broke. To understand why this weapon existed, you need to feel what British infantry felt in the summer of 1940. And what they felt was helpless. After Dunkirk, the British Army came home with almost nothing. They left their anti-tank guns on the beaches. They left their artillery in the fields. They left their vehicles on the roads of France. 300,000 men crossed the Channel carrying rifles and desperation and not much else. And every single one of them knew that across that water, Germany was building tanks faster than Britain could build anything. The standard anti-tank weapon issued to British infantry was the Boy's rifle. It fired a .55 caliber round enormous by rifle standards. On paper, it could punch through 21 millimeters of armor at 300 yards. The problem was simple and fatal. German tanks had moved past 21 millimeters. The Panzer III carried 30 to 50 millimeters of frontal armor, often sloped. A Boy's rifle round hit that plate and sparked and bounced and did absolutely nothing. Soldiers in North Africa described what that felt like. You aimed. You fired. You watched the spark where the bullet struck. And the tank kept rolling toward you as though you had thrown a stone. Men emptied full magazines into advancing panzers. Nothing. The armor held every single time. The psychological effect was devastating. Infantry began to believe tanks could not be stopped. Men who had fought bravely against other infantry broke and ran when they heard tracks grinding toward them. The confidence of an entire army was cracking. Anti-tank guns existed. The 6-pounder was excellent. The 17-pounder was a tank killer. But these weapons weighed thousands of pounds. They needed trucks to move. They needed crews to operate. They needed minutes to set up and aim. In the chaos of a fluid battle in a bombed village, in a sudden ambush, those minutes did not exist. A tank commander could spot a gun emplacement traverse his turret and destroy it before the crew got off a shot. Heavy guns saved battles, but they could not save the individual soldier caught alone when a panzer turned the corner. What infantry needed was something one man could carry into a fight. Something that could kill a tank at the range where the tank could kill him. Something portable enough to bring into a building, a trench, a crater. The physics for it already existed. The shaped charge, a cone of copper backed by explosive, could collapse upon detonation into a hypersonic jet capable of burning through armor far thicker than any bullet could penetrate. The science was there. The question that consumed every weapons designer in every Allied nation was brutally simple. How do you get that charge from the soldier's hands onto the tank's hull without killing the soldier? First, America answered with a rocket. Germany answered with a rocket. Britain answered with something so strange that experienced ordnance officers assumed it was a joke. Britain answered with a spring. The colonel nobody believed. Latham Valentine Stuart Blacker did not fit the profile of a man who would reshape infantry warfare. He was an Indian Army veteran, a colonial officer, an early aviation enthusiast who spent his spare time sketching weapons in notebooks that looked more like the diary of a restless inventor than any military specification. He had no prestigious laboratory. He had no team of engineers. He had an idea that he could not stop thinking about. In 1930, Blacker patented his spigot mortar. The principle reversed everything conventional weapons design had taught for centuries. A normal gun fires a projectile through a barrel. Expanding gas pushes the round down the tube and out the muzzle. Everyone understood this. Everyone trusted this. Blacker threw it away. His weapon used a solid steel rod fixed to a base. The bomb did not go inside a tube. The bomb sat over the rod, its hollow tail loaded with a small propellant charge. When fired, the rod struck that charge. The explosion threw the bomb forward and drove the rod backward into a heavy spring. All energy went into the projectile. Behind the weapon there was nothing. No flame, no blast, no expanding gas cloud, no danger zone. For a decade, Blacker carried this idea from office to office across London. For a decade, men in uniform listened politely and said no. Some were blunt. Some tried not to laugh. The weapon looked like something a plumber had built in a shed. It violated every principle that ordnance officers had been trained to trust. Projectiles go inside barrels. That was the rule. Blacker's projectile sat on top of a stick. That was not a weapon. That was a toy. 10 years of rejection. 10 years of walking into rooms where men had already decided the answer before he opened his mouth. A lesser man would have quit. Blacker kept walking into those rooms. Then in May 1940, the Germans took France in 6 weeks, and the British Army lost everything it owned on the beaches of Dunkirk. And suddenly, the men who had laughed at Stuart Blacker were desperate enough to listen. The toy shop. Churchill himself attended a demonstration of Blacker's first working creation in the summer of 1940. It was called the Blacker Bombard. It weighed 112 pounds. It sat on a fixed mount. It fired a 20-pound anti-tank bomb using the spigot principle. It was crude and ugly, and it worked. With a German invasion expected within weeks, the War Office ordered 22,000 of them for the Home Guard. Desperation had finally opened the door. But Blacker wanted more. He did not want a fixed weapon that sat in a field waiting for tanks to come to it. He wanted something a soldier could carry on his shoulder. Something that went where the infantry went. In June 1941, he demonstrated his portable version to the War Office, and everything collapsed. The casing cracked. The spigot misfired. Bombs tumbled end over end and slammed into the ground without detonating. The Ordnance Board's written verdict buried him. They declared the weapon would prove ineffective as an anti-tank weapon under any conceivable conditions of employment. Not unlikely to work. Not needing improvement. Ineffective under any conceivable conditions. That was not a rejection. That was an execution. Blacker was transferred to other duties. His portable spigot mortar was officially dead. Except one man refused to let it die. Major Millis Jeffress ran MD1, a secret weapons laboratory that answered directly to Churchill. The soldiers who knew about it called it the toy shop. It was the place where ideas too strange for the regular military went to be reborn. Jeffress had watched Blacker's failed demonstration and seen what nobody else in that room could see. The principle was right. The execution was wrong. The spigot concept eliminated backblast entirely. No other weapon design on Earth could make that claim. That single advantage was worth saving. Jeffress took the spigot mechanism and rebuilt it from scratch. He paired it with hollow charge warhead technology his team had developed for the No. 74 sticky grenade. He redesigned the casing with stronger materials. He improved the fusing so bombs would detonate reliably on impact. He strengthened the mainspring and reworked the firing mechanism. By early 1942, the weapon the Ordnance Board had killed was standing up and shooting again. The same officials who had written that devastating verdict watched the redesigned weapon punch through armor plate after armor plate. The expressions on their faces must have been something. Production began in August 1942 at IC-1 Billingham. 1 full month before the first American bazookas arrived in Egypt for British evaluation. The finished weapon was designated the PIAT, Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It weighed 32 pounds. It measured 39 inches. It fired a 2.5-pound bomb at 250 feet per second with an effective range of about 100 yards, maybe 50, against anything moving. And cocking it was an act of physical violence against your own body. The operator stood the PIAT on its butt, stepped on the shoulder pad, quarter-turned the body to unlock the spring, and hauled upward with everything he had. 200 pounds of pulling force. Shorter soldiers sometimes could not do it. Training manuals admitted that recocking while prone required practice and considerable strength, which was a polite way of saying most men could not manage it without standing up and exposing themselves to enemy fire. It was heavy. It was painful. It was exhausting to operate. And it could do something no other anti-tank weapon in any army on Earth could do. It could fire from inside a room without killing everyone in it. First blood. Tunisia. Early 1943. The PIAT went to war in North Africa. British and Canadian units carried it into the Tunisian hills against Rommel's Afrika Korps. The early results were rough. Fuses failed if the bomb struck at a bad angle. Misfires happened. Soldiers cursed the weight and the cocking and the recoil that could knock a standing man flat on his back. But the intelligence reports told a different story. German tank crews were reporting hits from weapons they could not find. No smoke trail to follow, no muzzle flash to spot, no roaring whoosh to locate. PIAT teams fired from hidden positions with a sound that witnesses described as a dull thud, hit their targets and vanished. The Germans could not suppress what they could not see. For the first time in the war, a single infantryman with a shoulder weapon could engage a tank and survive not because the weapon was fast to reload, but because the enemy never knew where the shot came from. In July 1943, the Canadians carried PIATs into Sicily, and there in the narrow streets and stone buildings of Italian towns, the weapon found its true purpose. A PIAT team could set up inside a house fire through a window, destroy a vehicle in the street below, and relocate before anyone understood what had happened. Try that with an American bazooka, and the backblast would incinerate the room and everyone in it. Try that with a German Panzerschreck, and the result was even worse. The PIAT was the only anti-tank weapon on Earth that could fight indoors. And the war was about to move indoors in ways nobody had imagined. What comes next? By the end of 1943, the PIAT had proven itself. It had killed tanks in North Africa. It had cleared streets in Sicily. It had given infantry something they had not felt since 1940. Confidence. The belief that one man with one weapon could face a panzer and win. But Tunisia and Sicily were the warm-up. In 1944, the war would enter the most savage phase of close combat in European history. The hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a death trap. The mountain fortress of Monte Cassino, where a 23-year-old fusilier named Francis Jefferson would pick up a PIAT from the hands of a dead comrade, charge a German tank under direct fire, and burn it alive at point-blank range. The bridge at Arnhem, where Major Robert Kane would fire PIATs until a bomb exploded in his face, blinding him, rupturing both eardrums, and he still refused to stop. The PIAT had passed its first test. The real trial was coming, and it would be written in fire. In Part 2, we go to Normandy, to Cassino, to Arnhem, and we meet Smoky Smith, the Canadian private, who stood alone with a PIAT against 3 Panther tanks and 30 German soldiers, and did something that should have been impossible. He did not run. In Part 1, a retired Indian Army colonel named Stuart Blacker spent 10 years being rejected by every military office in London. His weapon fired bombs off a steel rod using a spring. No rocket, no barrel, no backblast. The British Ordnance Board declared it impossible. A secret laboratory called the Toy Shop proved them wrong. By early 1943, the Piat had killed its first tanks in North Africa. It had cleared streets in Sicily. It had done something no rocket launcher on Earth could do. It fired from inside buildings without killing the operator. But killing a few tanks in Tunisia was one thing. Convincing an entire army to trust a 32-pound spring-loaded nightmare over the lighter, simpler American Bazooka was something else entirely. In the spring of 1943, 15,000 American M1 bazookas were offered to the British Army through Lend-Lease. 15,000. And a growing number of senior British officers wanted to take them. The PIAT had survived the laboratory. It had survived the desert. Now, it had to survive something far more dangerous than German armor. British Army politics. The generals who said no. March 1943, London. The debate inside the War Office was brutal. On one side, officers who had seen the PIAT perform in North Africa argued that no weapon in the Allied arsenal could match its concealment advantage. On the other side, logistics officers and ordnance planners pointed at the numbers and shook their heads. The bazooka weighed 18 pounds. The Piat weighed 32. The bazooka could be operated by any soldier after an hour of training. The Piat required a man strong enough to pull 200 pounds of force just to cock it. The bazooka had an effective range of 150 yards. The Piat maxed out at 100, and everyone who had actually fired one in combat said 50 was closer to the truth. One senior ordnance officer put it bluntly during a planning session. "We are asking men to carry twice the weight for half the range. We are asking them to wrestle a spring mechanism that half of them cannot physically operate." The Americans have solved this problem more elegantly. We should accept their solution. The argument made perfect sense on paper. It nearly killed the PIAT. What saved the weapon was not a general. It was a report from a captain named Nobody Remembers, filed from a bombed-out village in Tunisia. The report described a PIAT team that had engaged a Panzer III from inside a collapsed farmhouse. The bomb destroyed the tank. The two-man team walked out the back door and disappeared into an olive grove. A bazooka team attempting the same shot would have set the farmhouse on fire and announced their position to every German within half a mile. That report landed on the desk of Major General Percy Hobart, one of the most unconventional thinkers in the British Army. Hobart had already been forced into retirement once for pushing ideas too radical for his superiors. Churchill had personally pulled him back into service. Hobart read the Tunisia report and understood immediately what the logistics officers could not see from their desks in London. The next phase of the war would not be fought in open desert. It would be fought in the hedgerows of France, the rubble of Italian cities, and the streets of German towns. In those environments, the ability to fire from concealment without backblast was not a minor advantage. It was the difference between living and dying. Hobart pushed hard. He lobbied commanders planning the invasion of Italy. He argued that the Piat's weight penalty was irrelevant if the operator survived to fire a second shot, which bazooka operators frequently did not. He pointed to German after-action reports captured in Tunisia that described being hit by weapons they could not locate or suppress. The decision came down in June 1943. The British Army would keep the Piat as its primary infantry anti-tank weapon. American bazookas would be accepted in limited numbers for evaluation, but would not replace the British design. 115,000 PIATs would be produced before the war ended. The spring had won the boardroom. Now it had to win the battlefield, and the battlefield that awaited was hell. Monte Cassino, May 1944. The Gustav Line. A wall of German fortifications stretching across the Italian peninsula anchored by the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, perched on a hilltop that overlooked every approach. 4 Allied assaults had been thrown against this position. 4 times the attackers had been driven back with devastating casualties. The terrain was a defender's paradise. Rocky slopes channeled attacking infantry into kill zones. German tanks and self-propelled guns covered every road. On May 16, 1944, Fusilier Francis Jefferson and his battalion of the Lancashire Fusiliers advanced into the valley below the monastery. They were immediately caught in a crossfire. Machine guns raked them from fortified positions. Mortar rounds walked through their ranks. And then a German tank appeared on the road ahead, its hull down behind rubble, its gun traversing toward the pinned infantry. The PIAT team assigned to Jefferson's platoon moved forward. They set up. They fired. The bomb fell short. Before they could reload, a burst of machine gun fire cut through both men. The PIAT lay on the ground next to 2 bodies. The tank was still there. Its machine gun was still firing. And 23-year-old Francis Jefferson made a decision that defied every survival instinct a human being possesses. He ran forward. Not backward. Not sideways into cover. Forward. Directly toward the tank. He grabbed the PIAT from the dead man's hands. He cocked the weapon. 200 pounds of force standing upright, fully exposed, while bullets tore the air around him. He dropped to one knee. He aimed. 50 yards. Maybe less. At that range, the shaped charge would either penetrate and kill the crew, or bounce off and leave him kneeling in the open with an empty weapon that took 30 seconds to reload. He fired. The bomb struck the tank's hull. The shaped charge detonated. The copper jet punched through the armor and ignited the ammunition stored inside. The turret blew open. Flames erupted from every hatch. The tank burned. Jefferson did not stop. He cocked the PIAT again. He advanced further. He engaged a second fortified position, then a third. He kept firing until the immediate threat to his platoon was destroyed. For this action, Francis Jefferson received the Victoria Cross. He was 23 years old. He had picked up a weapon from a dead man's grip and charged a tank with it. The PIAT that everyone said was too heavy, too slow, too crude, had just broken open a piece of the Gustav Line. But Monte Cassino was a single battle on a single front. 3 weeks after Jefferson earned his cross, the largest amphibious invasion in human history hit the beaches of Normandy. And it was there, in the claustrophobic nightmare of the Norman hedgerows, that the PIAT proved the generals in London right. Normandy, June 1944. The bocage was unlike anything the Allied planners had anticipated. Ancient hedgerows 10 feet thick and 6 feet tall divided the Norman countryside into thousands of tiny enclosed fields. Each field was a fortress. Each lane between them was a kill zone. Tanks could not see more than 1 field ahead. Infantry could not advance without walking into ambush positions that the Germans had prepared with terrifying thoroughness. American forces in the bocage relied heavily on bazookas for close-range anti-tank defense. The results were catastrophic. The M1 bazooka's back blast made it nearly impossible to fire from the hedgerow positions that provided the only available cover. The smoke trail instantly revealed the operator's position. German tankers learned to spray the hedgerow behind any smoke trail with machine gun fire. Bazooka teams were being killed after their first shot at rates that alarmed American commanders. British PIAT teams operated differently. A PIAT could be fired through a gap in a hedgerow with the operator completely concealed behind it. The weapon's dull thud did not carry far enough for German crews to identify the source. The absence of smoke meant there was nothing to trace. British after-action reports from the early Overlord period recorded that PIAT teams accounted for 7% of all German armor destroyed by British forces. 7% from a weapon operated by 2-man infantry teams on foot. That figure exceeded the kill rate of RAF Typhoon fighter bombers armed with rockets aircraft that cost thousands of times more and required entire airfields to support. The hedgerows were hell for everyone. But for PIAT operators, the enclosed terrain was an advantage. They fired. They hit. They disappeared. And the Germans could not figure out where the shots were coming from. Italy. October 1944. The Savio River. Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith did not look like a man who would earn the highest military decoration in the British Commonwealth. He had been busted in rank multiple times for disciplinary infractions. He drank too much. He fought too often. He was exactly the kind of soldier that sergeants cursed and officers tried to transfer. He was also, when the shooting started, absolutely without fear. On the night of October 21, 1944, Smith's company of the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada established a small bridgehead across the Savio River in Italy. The position was immediately counterattacked. 3 Panther tanks, 2 self-propelled guns, and approximately 30 German infantry advanced on the bridgehead. The Canadians had no anti-tank guns across the river. They had no armor support. They had Piets. Smith grabbed one. He moved forward across open ground toward the lead Panther. 30 feet. He closed to 30 feet from a 45-ton tank whose machine guns were firing and whose 75mm cannon could vaporize him. He fired the Piet. The bomb struck the Panther and it exploded. The crew bailed out. Smith cut them down with his Thompson submachine gun. The explosion drew 10 German infantry who charged his position. Smith killed 4 of them with the Thompson. The rest fell back. A second Panther advanced. Smith moved to engage it. The tank reversed and withdrew rather than face whatever had just destroyed the first one. Smith then ran back to his wounded companion, dragged him to cover, and held the position until reinforcements arrived. For this action, Ernest "Smoky" Smith received the Victoria Cross. 1 man, 1 Piat, 1 Thompson. Against 3 Panthers, 2 self-propelled guns and 30 infantry. He held a river crossing alone. The citation noted his gruesome coolness and determination. Soldiers who witnessed it used different words. They said Smoky was out of his mind. And they said it with absolute respect. 6 crosses, 1 weapon. By the autumn of 1944, the Piat had accumulated a combat record that no other infantry anti-tank weapon could match. 6 Victoria Crosses awarded for actions involving the weapon. More than any other anti-tank system of the entire war. 115,000 units produced. 7% of all German tanks destroyed by British forces in Normandy. The Canadian survey naming it the single most effective infantry weapon. These were not statistics manufactured by propaganda officers. These were numbers drawn from blood. But the weapon's greatest test was not in the hedgerows of France or the rivers of Italy. It was coming in a place where every advantage the Piat possessed would be pushed to its absolute limit. A place where paratroopers would be surrounded, cut off, outnumbered, and forced to fight house to house for 9 days against an enemy that had tanks and they did not. The bridge was at a town called Arnhem. The operation was called Market Garden, and Major Robert Henry Kane of the South Staffordshire Regiment was about to fight the most extraordinary single combat action of the Second World War, with a Piat in his hands. On September 17, 1944, 9 days of horror began. Kane would fire Piats until the bombs ran out. He would fire them until a round detonated prematurely in his face and blinded him. He would stuff field dressings in his burst eardrums and keep fighting. He would become the only Victoria Cross recipient at Arnhem to survive the battle. And his story makes everything you have heard so far sound like a warm-up. In Part 3, we go to Arnhem, and we do not come back the same. A retired colonel's impossible idea became a weapon. That weapon was rejected, resurrected in a secret laboratory, and sent to war. In North Africa, it drew first blood. In Sicily, it cleared streets. At Monte Cassino, a 23-year-old fusilier named Francis Jefferson charged a German tank with one and burned it alive. At the Savio River, a Canadian private named Smoky Smith stood alone with a Piat against 3 Panthers and 30 infantry and refused to die. 5 Victoria Crosses had been earned. 115,000 Piats had been built. The weapon had proven itself in open fields and hedgerows and river crossings, and in the narrow streets of Italian towns. But nothing that had come before prepared anyone for what happened next. In September 1944, the Allied High Command launched the most ambitious airborne operation in the history of warfare. 35,000 paratroopers dropped behind German lines in the Netherlands. The objective was a series of bridges that would open a highway straight into the industrial heart of Germany. The operation was called Market Garden. The furthest bridge was at a town called Arnhem, and the men sent to take it would be surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from reinforcement, and forced to hold their ground for 9 days against an enemy that had tanks artillery and 10 times their numbers. The paratroopers had no anti-tank guns. They had no armor. They had PIATs. And one man was about to use that weapon in a way that defied every limit anyone believed it had. The German counterpunch. By the autumn of 1944, German intelligence had identified the PIT as a serious tactical problem. Captured weapons had been sent to ordnance evaluation centers. German engineers disassembled them, studied the spigot mechanism, analyzed the shaped charge warhead, and wrote reports that circulated through armored unit commanders on the Western Front. The conclusions were blunt. The weapon was crude. The range was pathetic. The warhead was adequate against side and rear armor, but could not penetrate the frontal plate of a Panther or Tiger. Under normal combat conditions, a trained tank crew should be able to identify and destroy a Piat team before it got close enough to fire. But the reports also contained a warning that alarmed German commanders. Unlike the American Bazooka, and unlike their own Panzerschreck, the British weapon produced no smoke trail, no muzzle flash, and almost no audible signature. Tank crews hit by PIATs consistently reported that they could not identify the firing position. In urban terrain, this made the weapon extremely dangerous. German standing orders were updated. Tank commanders operating in built-up areas were instructed to increase infantry screening around their vehicles and to treat every window, every doorway, every gap in a wall as a potential firing position. The Germans had also developed their own countermeasures earlier in the war. Scherzen armored side skirts bolted onto the hulls and turrets of Panzer IIIs, IVs, and assault guns had been introduced in 1943, primarily to defeat Soviet anti-tank rifles. But these skirts also provided partial protection against shaped charge weapons. The thin steel plate caused some hollow charge warheads to detonate prematurely before the copper jet could form properly against the main armor. A 1943 American intelligence bulletin confirmed that the 2.36-inch bazooka could not reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor even without Scherzen. The Piat faced the same limitation. Both weapons now required flanking shots against heavy German armor, which meant getting close, getting to the side or rear, and firing before the tank's turret could traverse onto you. The odds of surviving that maneuver were not good. The odds at Arnhem would be worse. A weapon's worst enemy. Itself. The PIAT's growing combat reputation could not hide a problem that every soldier who carried one knew intimately. The weapon was fighting its operators as hard as it fought the Germans. Misfire rates in the field remained stubbornly high. The fusing mechanism on the 2.5-pound bomb required a near-perpendicular impact to detonate reliably. Glancing hits shots that struck at shallow angles, rounds that hit soft ground before reaching the target, all could result in a bomb that simply thudded against armor and fell to the ground without exploding. Soldiers in Italy reported misfire rates as high as 1 in 4 under combat conditions. 1 in 4. That meant a Piat operator had a 25% chance of pulling the trigger, exposing his position, and achieving absolutely nothing except telling the enemy where he was. The weight problem had not improved. 32 pounds for the weapon, plus the bombs meant that a Piat team, moving at infantry pace across broken ground, was slower than every other soldier in the platoon. In the fast-moving advance across France after the Normandy breakout, some units reported that Piat teams could not keep up with the rifle companies they were supposed to protect, and the cocking mechanism remained an act of physical brutality. Sergeant Wagger Thornton of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, one of the glider troops who had seized Pegasus Bridge on D-Day, was characteristically blunt. He called the PIAT a load of rubbish. He said the realistic range was about 50 yards and no more. And he delivered the most damning assessment any soldier ever gave the weapon. You must never miss. If you do, you have had it. Because by the time you reload the thing, which is a bloody chore on its own, everything is gone. You are done. Never miss. One shot. One chance. And if that shot fails, you are standing in front of a tank with an empty weapon that takes 30 seconds and 200 pounds of force to make ready again. That was the weapon the paratroopers carried into Arnhem. One shot. Make it count. Or die. Arnhem, September 17th to 25th, 1944. The plan was bold to the point of recklessness. 3 airborne divisions would drop along a 64-mile corridor through the occupied Netherlands, seizing bridges at Eindhoven-Nijmegen and Arnhem. Ground forces of the British Technische Corps would race north along a single highway, linking up with each airborne force in sequence. If everything worked, the Allies would have a bridge across the Rhine at Arnhem and an open road into Germany. The war could be over by Christmas. Nothing worked. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped 8 miles from the Arnhem Bridge on September 17th. Only one battalion, the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, reached the bridge and seized its northern end. The rest of the division was scattered, delayed, and engaged by German forces far stronger than intelligence had predicted. 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting in the Arnhem area. Nobody had expected them to be there. The paratroopers had dropped into the lap of 2 armored divisions with nothing heavier than a Piat. Frost's men held the north end of the bridge for 4 days against continuous assault. German armor infantry artillery and even naval guns mounted on half-tracks pounded their positions. The paratroopers fought from buildings, from rubble, from cellars. They fought room to room. They fired Piats from windows, from doorways, from holes blown in walls. The zero backblast that Stuart Blacker's spigot principle provided was no longer a theoretical advantage. It was the only reason the defenders could engage armor at all. Every position was enclosed. Every shot was fired from inside a structure. A bazooka would have been useless. A Panzerschreck would have been suicidal. Meanwhile, to the west, the rest of the 1st Airborne Division was fighting a desperate perimeter defense around the village of Oosterbeek. It was here that Major Robert Henry Kane of the 2nd Battalion South Staffordshire Regiment began a 6-day war against German armor that has no equal in the history of infantry combat. September 19th. A German self-propelled gun advances on Kane's position. He picks up a Piat. He moves to a window. He fires. The bomb strikes. The vehicle burns. He cocks the weapon. 200 pounds of force. He loads another bomb. He waits. September 20th. More armor. Kane engages tank after tank. He fires from buildings. He fires from garden walls. He fires from behind rubble piles. Each time, the dull thud of the PIAT gives no indication of where the shot originated. Each time, the German vehicle is hit before the crew can locate him. His comrades later credited him with disabling or driving off multiple armored vehicles in 48 hours. The exact count was never confirmed because nobody had time to count. Then, on the afternoon of September 20th, it happens. Kane fires a PIAT at close range. The bomb detonates prematurely. The explosion hits him full in the face. He goes blind. Both eardrums rupture simultaneously. He collapses. Blood pours from his ears. Men grab him and drag him toward cover. Witnesses say that as they pulled him across the ground, blinded, deafened, bleeding. Kane was screaming. Not screaming in pain. Screaming for someone to pick up the Piat. Grab the Piat. Do not leave the Piat. His sight returned after 30 minutes. His hearing did not. Both eardrums were destroyed. Kane stuffed field dressings into his ears to stop the bleeding. A medic told him he needed evacuation. Kane refused. There was no evacuation. There was nowhere to go. The perimeter was shrinking. German armor was pressing in from every direction, and the PIAT was still the only thing standing between the paratroopers and annihilation. Kane kept fighting, day after day, September 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. He fired Piats until the Piat ammunition ran out. Then he switched to a 2-inch mortar and engaged the tanks with that. When the mortar ammunition ran out, he found a Piat with 3 remaining bombs. He fired those too. On September 25th, after 9 days of continuous combat, the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division withdrew across the Rhine in a night evacuation. Of the roughly 10,000 men who had gone into Arnhem, fewer than 2,500 came out. Kane walked out on his own feet. Deaf, exhausted, alive. For his actions across those 9 days, Robert Henry Kane received the Victoria Cross. He was the only living recipient of the decoration from the Battle of Arnhem. Every other Arnhem 5C was awarded posthumously. Kane survived because he understood something about the PIAT that no specification sheet could capture. In a city turned to rubble where every room was a firing position and every wall was cover, a weapon with no backblast was not just useful. It was everything. The numbers that changed minds. After Arnhem, after Normandy, after Italy, the argument about the Piat versus the Bazooka was over. Not because anyone in London declared victory, because the numbers made the argument for themselves. British Army analysis of the initial Overlord period confirmed that Piat teams had destroyed 7% of all German armor knocked out by British forces. To put that in context, the RAF's rocket firing. Typhoon fighter bombers, the most feared ground attack aircraft in the Allied arsenal, achieved a lower kill rate against German armor than infantry teams carrying a 32-pound spring-loaded tube. Aircraft costing tens of thousands of pounds, requiring trained pilots, ground crews, airfields, fuel depots, and entire logistics chains were outperformed by 2 men lying behind a hedgerow with a weapon that cost a fraction of the price. The 161-officer Canadian Army survey, conducted after the war, asked combat veterans to rank infantry weapons by effectiveness. The P8 placed first, above the Bren light machine gun, above the 2-inch mortar, above the rifle, above everything. Officers who had cursed the weapon's weight, who had struggled with its cocking mechanism, who had watched bombs misfire and fall short, still ranked it number 1. Because when it worked, nothing else in the infantry arsenal could do what it did. Over 200 PIAT units were specifically airdropped to the French resistance. The reasoning was simple and lethal. Resistance fighters operated in occupied cities and towns. They attacked from buildings, from cellars, from rooftops. They needed a weapon that could destroy a German vehicle and leave no trace of where the shot came from. The Piat was perfect for this. Resistance operatives could fire from inside a house, kill a vehicle in the street, walk out the back door, and disappear into the civilian population. No smoke trail for patrols to follow. No backblast damage to indicate which building the shot came from. The weapon that British soldiers called a plumber's nightmare became the urban guerrilla's best friend. The 6 Victoria Crosses earned with Piats represented more than any other infantry anti-tank weapon of the war. Jefferson at Cassino, Smith at the Savio, Kane at Arnhem. Each cross told the same story. One man, close range, no room for error. The weapon demanded courage because it demanded proximity. You could not kill a tank with a Piat from a safe distance. There was no safe distance. You got close or you did not fire at all, and getting close to a tank meant accepting that if you missed, or if the fuse failed, or if the bomb struck at a bad angle, you were dead. The men who earned those crosses did not have better weapons than anyone else. They had the same 32-pound, 50-yard one-shot nightmare that every Piat operator carried. What they had that could not be manufactured or issued or requisitioned was the willingness to close that distance and pull the trigger, knowing the odds. The question. Nobody asked. By the winter of 1944, the Piat had earned its place in military history. It had broken through at Cassino. It had held the hedgerows at Normandy. It had defended the perimeter at Arnhem. It had armed the resistance. It had accumulated a combat record measured in destroyed tanks, Victoria Crosses, and the grudging respect of soldiers who hated carrying it, but trusted it with their lives. But the war was not over, and a question was forming that nobody in the British Army wanted to confront. The Piat worked because of where the war was fought: urban terrain, hedgerows, rubble, enclosed spaces. What happened when the terrain changed? What happened when the enemy changed? What happened when the tanks got heavier, the armor got thicker, and the battlefields got wider? The Americans were already answering that question. The M1 Bazooka had failed in Korea against Soviet T-34 tanks. The urgent development of the M20 Super Bazooka with its 3.5-inch warhead was already underway. The Germans had captured American bazookas in Tunisia and built the Panzerschreck, an 88mm monster that could penetrate 160 millimeters of armor. Soviet engineers were studying both designs and sketching what would eventually become the RPG-2 and then the RPG-7, the most produced anti-tank weapon in human history. The rocket was evolving. The spring was not. And the man who had started it all, the retired Indian Army colonel who spent a decade being laughed out of offices, the man whose impossible idea had saved lives from Casino to Arnhem, was about to be forgotten. In Part 4, we follow the PIAT to its final battles. We watch the weapon that changed the war become an evolutionary dead end. We trace the bazooka's lineage forward to the RPG-7, the M72 LAW, the Javelin, and every shoulder-fired anti-tank weapon on Earth today. And we answer the question that matters most. Was Britain right to reject the American bazooka? Or did they choose a weapon that won the battle but lost the future? The answer is not what you expect. A retired Indian Army colonel named Stuart Blacker spent 10 years being laughed out of every military office in London. His weapon fired bombs off a steel rod using a spring. The Ordnance Board declared it impossible. A secret laboratory called the Toy Shop rebuilt it from scratch. The British Army mass-produced it rejected America's bazooka and sent 115,000 Piats to war. At Monte Cassino, Francis Jefferson charged a tank with one. At the Savio River, Smoky Smith stood alone against 3 Panthers and 30 infantry with one. At Arnhem, Robert Kane fired PIATs for 9 days straight until a bomb exploded in his face, blinding him, rupturing both eardrums, and he still refused to stop fighting. 6 Victoria Crosses. 7% of all German tanks destroyed by British forces in Normandy. The most effective infantry weapon of the war, according to the men who actually used it. But the war ended. And what happened next to the weapon, to the men who built it, and to the man who dreamed it up in the first place, is a story almost nobody tells. Because the final chapter of the PIAT contains a twist that reframes everything you have just heard. Success and irrelevance arrived at the same time. The colonel who vanished. Stuart Blacker did not receive a Victoria Cross. He did not receive a knighthood. He did not stand on a stage while generals shook his hand and thanked him for the weapon that had held the line at Arnhem. After the War Office transferred him away from his own project in 1941, after the Ordnance Board declared his design would fail under any conceivable conditions, Blacker faded from the story of his own invention. Millis Jeffress, the man who ran the toy shop and rebuilt Blacker's design into the weapon that went to war, received a knighthood and was appointed commander of the Order of the British Empire. He had earned it. Without Jeffress, the spigot mortar concept would have died on the floor of that failed 1941 demonstration. But the public record of who invented the principle, who spent a decade fighting for it, who refused to stop believing, when everyone else refused to start that record, grew quieter with each passing year. Blacker returned to private life after the war. He did not write a memoir. He did not give interviews. He did not tour lecture halls, telling audiences about the weapon that bore the engineering DNA of his 1930 patent. The man who had conceived the one anti-tank weapon in the entire Second World War that could fire from inside a building without killing the operator lived out his remaining years in relative obscurity. He died in 1964. His obituary mentioned his military service. It did not dwell on the Piat. The Victoria Cross recipients fared differently, though not always easily. Francis Jefferson survived the war. He returned to Lancashire and lived until 1982. He rarely spoke publicly about Monte Cassino or about charging a German tank at the age of 23 with a dead man's weapon. When asked, he deflected. He said he did what anyone would have done. Anyone who has read the citation knows that is not true. Smoky Smith went home to Canada and became a national figure, though he carried the war with him in ways that did not show in photographs. He made public appearances. He represented veterans. He was the last surviving Canadian Victoria Cross recipient of the Second World War when he died in 2005 at the age of 91. At his funeral, the Canadian military gave him full honors. The country mourned. But few of the mourners knew the specific details of what he had done at the Savio River. They knew the medal. They did not know the 30 feet between a man with a Piat and a Panther tank in the dark. Robert Kane, the man who fought for 9 days at Arnhem, deaf and bleeding, returned to civilian life and became a businessman. He lived until 1974. He was 55 years old when he died. 30 years was not a long life after what his body endured in those 9 days. The burst eardrums, the temporary blindness, the constant concussive blasts of PIAT bombs fired from enclosed spaces. The medical records from Arnhem suggest that many survivors carried injuries visible and invisible that shortened their lives in ways that peacetime doctors could not always measure. These men did not build the weapon. They did not design it. They did not lobby for it. They simply picked it up and used it at ranges where survival was not expected. The weapon's legacy belongs to them as much as it belongs to Blacker or Jeffress. Perhaps more. But the true legacy of the Piat is not measured in medals or obituaries. It is measured in what came after. And what came after is the strangest part of the entire story. The dead end and the dynasty. The PIAT served through the end of World War II and into the Korean War. British forces carried it to Korea in 1950. But the weapon that had dominated the close terrain of Normandy and the rubble of Arnhem found itself in a different kind of war. Korea's terrain was open. Engagement ranges were longer. The North Korean T-34/85 tanks were faster and more heavily armored than anything the Piat had been designed to face. The weapon's 50-yard realistic range and its unreliable fusing made it increasingly inadequate against modern armor in open country. In the early 1950s, the British Army quietly retired the Piat and adopted the American M20 Super Bazooka as its replacement. The 3.5-inch rocket launcher offered superior range, greater penetration, and far easier operation. The spigot mortar principle that Blacker had patented in 1930 and that Jeffress had perfected in 1942 was abandoned. No successor was designed. No improved version was developed. No other nation adopted the concept. The Piat was an evolutionary dead end, a weapon with no descendants. The bazooka's story could not have been more different. The original M1, that had struggled in Tunisia and failed spectacularly in Korea, spawned a lineage that stretches directly to the most advanced anti-tank weapons on Earth today. The Germans captured American bazookas in North Africa in 1943, recognized the rocket launcher concept's potential, and within months had fielded the Panzerschreck, an 88mm scaled-up version that could penetrate 160 millimeters of armor. German engineers took the idea further and developed the Panzerfaust, a single-use disposable launcher that armed every infantry squad with anti-tank capability. After the war, Soviet weapons designers studied both American and German designs. They combined the bazooka's reloadable launcher concept with the Panzerfaust's warhead principles, and in 1949 produced the RPG-2. 12 years later, in 1961, they introduced the RPG-7. That weapon became the most widely produced, most widely distributed, and most widely used anti-tank weapon in the history of warfare. It has been fired in every conflict on every continent since its introduction. It has been manufactured by over a dozen countries. Estimates suggest that over 9 million RPG-7s have been produced worldwide. The American lineage continued in parallel. The M20 Super Bazooka led to the M72 Law, a lightweight disposable launcher that served through Vietnam and beyond. The Law concept evolved into the AT-4, the N-Law, and ultimately the FGM-148, Javelin of Fire, and forget guided missile system that can destroy any tank on Earth from a range of over 2,500 meters. In the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, Javelin missiles supplied to Ukrainian forces have destroyed Russian armor at rates that would have seemed impossible to the men who fired Piats at 50 yards. Every single one of these weapons traces its ancestry to the shoulder-fired shaped charge concept that the bazooka pioneered. The rocket won the future. The spring did not. 115,000 Piats were built. None survived as a design principle. The bazooka's descendants number in the tens of millions and are carried by soldiers in virtually every army on Earth. The weapon that lost the evaluation won the century. The paradox of being right. This is where the story becomes something more than military history. Because the British decision to reject the bazooka in 1942 was not wrong. It was right. And it was still a dead end. Both things are true at the same time. The British looked at the bazooka and saw a weapon that could not fire from buildings. They looked at the PIAT and saw a weapon that could. They looked at the war they were about to fight in the hedgerows and rubble and narrow streets of Western Europe, and they made the correct tactical calculation. In that specific war, on that specific terrain, against that specific enemy, the Piat was the better tool. The combat record proved it beyond any reasonable argument. 7% of armor kills in Normandy. 6 Victoria Crosses. First place in the Canadian Weapons Survey. 200 units dropped to the French resistance because no other weapon could do what the Piat did in urban guerrilla operations. But the British solved the problem in front of them. The Americans solved the problem ahead of them. The bazooka was lighter, simpler, easier to manufacture, easier to operate, and most importantly, easier to improve. You could scale up a rocket. You could increase its range. You could guide it. You could make it disposable. You could make it smart. The rocket was a platform. The spring was a solution. History is full of examples like this. The best answer to today's problem is not always the best foundation for tomorrow's technology. The Spitfire was superior to early American fighters in 1940, but the design philosophy behind the P-51 Mustang proved more adaptable. The German Tiger tank was the most feared vehicle on the battlefield in 1943, but the mass-produced Sherman individually inferior won the war through numbers and reliability and continuous improvement. Innovation is not just about building the best weapon for this battle. It is about building the weapon that can become something better for the next one. Blacker and Jeffress built a masterpiece of lateral thinking. They solved an impossible problem with an impossible solution. They gave infantry the ability to kill tanks from inside buildings using a principle so unconventional that trained ordnance officers could not believe it worked, even after watching it work. That achievement deserves respect. That achievement saved lives. That achievement was also, in the long arc of military technology, a beautiful dead end. The men who champion ideas that the establishment rejects face a particular kind of fate. If the idea fails, they are forgotten. If the idea succeeds but has no future, they are remembered briefly and then forgotten. Only if the idea succeeds and becomes the foundation for what follows does the inventor become a legend. Blacker's idea succeeded brilliantly and led to nothing. That is why almost no one knows his name. The detail almost nobody knows. There is one final piece of this story that most histories omit. When the British evaluated those American bazookas in Egypt in 1942, they did not simply test them and walk away. They wrote a detailed assessment that acknowledged every advantage the American weapon possessed. Lighter weight, easier operation, faster reloading, greater effective range. The British testers were not blind to these qualities. They were not arrogant. They were not dismissive. But the assessment contained a single paragraph that decided everything. The testers noted that the bazooka's backblast made it impossible to fire from enclosed positions. They noted that British tactical doctrine for the coming European campaign anticipated extensive combat in built-up areas, fortified positions, and close terrain. And they concluded that a weapon which could not be used in the tactical environments where infantry anti-tank capability was most desperately needed was not an acceptable primary weapon, regardless of its other advantages. That paragraph was written before Normandy, before Cassino, before Arnhem, before any of the battles that would prove the assessment correct. The British did not know what was coming. They could not have known the specific horrors of the bocage or the 9 days in Oosterbeek. But they understood their own doctrine. They understood what kind of war they intended to fight, and they chose accordingly. The paragraph was not a guess. It was a prediction. And the prediction was confirmed by the blood of every soldier who fired a piet from inside a building and walked out alive. Meanwhile, in a storage room at the Imperial War Museum in London, a piet sits behind glass. 32 pounds of steel and spring. Visitors walk past it without stopping. Most do not know what it is. Most have never heard the name. It looks exactly like what it always looked like: a plumber's nightmare. A crude, ugly, brutal piece of engineering that has no elegance and no descendants and no future. It also has 6 Victoria Crosses and the ghosts of every tank it ever killed. Conclusion. From a retired colonial officer with a sketch on a napkin to a weapon that outperformed fighter bombers in Normandy. From a laboratory rejection declared impossible to 6 of the highest military decorations the British Commonwealth can bestow. From a decade of laughter in London offices to the ruins of Arnhem, where a blinded, deafened major screamed for someone to pick up the piet because the tanks were still coming. Stuart Blacker proved that the most important ideas in history do not always come from the expected places. They come from stubborn men with unconventional minds who refuse to stop walking into rooms where the answer is always no. Millis Jeffress proved that a good idea in the wrong hands is just a failed demonstration, and a good idea in the right hands is a weapon that changes wars. Jefferson, Smith, and Kane proved that no specification sheet, no ordnance evaluation, no laboratory test can measure what matters most. Courage at 30 feet. Willingness to fire. Refusal to die. 115,000 piets. 6 Victoria Crosses. 7% of all German armor destroyed by British forces at Normandy. A weapon ranked number 1 by the men who bled beside it. And a spring, a simple steel spring, that for 3 years made the difference between an infantryman who could fight a tank and an infantryman who could only run from one. Britain said no to America's bazooka. The combat record says they were right. The history of technology says the bazooka won anyway. Both truths stand. Both truths matter. But if you were a British paratrooper at Arnhem in September 1944, surrounded by tanks trapped in a burning building with no artillery, no air support, no armor, and no way out, there was only one weapon on Earth that you could fire from that room without killing yourself. It was not a bazooka. It was the ugly, heavy, crude, brutal weapon that a retired colonel dreamed up and a secret laboratory made real, and it saved your life. If you know another story like this, a forgotten weapon, a rejected idea, an unknown person who changed the course of a war, share it in the comments. History is full of these stories. Most of them have never been told. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one, because the best stories in military history are never about the weapons everyone remembers. They are about the weapons everyone forgot.